I'm recording these and putting them on YouTube. There's a few people that are in the machining program that are double booked, because originally the hardware class, if you remember, in the real world was scheduled at 1 o'clock. And they're actually one of the few people that has an actual lab. So they are in there kind of spread way out and are in there getting doing lab stuff. So, all right, so at any rate, we'll get started here. I think almost everybody's here. We got good attendance today, which is awesome. So what you'll notice too, first of all, in the other class, you have a quiz. Same thing for the hardware class. I know some of you are just in the software. I'm gonna try to alternate those at least a little bit, but this initial quiz too is very short. So I'm just giving you a quick set of questions to kind of get the ball rolling, and then also hopefully that if you haven't been reading the book very much, maybe this is an added incentive to kind of open the book a little bit and get that going. If you don't have the book for some reason, please let me know, or contact other students on Discord and they can help you out with the book situation. So we've been looking at both books. I mean, this lecture is kind of hard. They both go together so well, the two classes, but we do have to kind of talk about each one. And there are just a small handful of you too that only are in the 115 class. Most of you are in both classes, because if you're doing the 2-year program, both classes are ultimately required. So there may be some people that are taking it just as an elective credit or something like that. Or last year we did have a waiting list, and when we had the physical constraints at the classroom, there were 2 or 3 people that maybe that couldn't get into the class and then are taking the class a year later. So at any rate, we will pick up here what we're talking about in both classes. But be looking on Canvas. I have the one for the hardware class. It's almost done. So you should see some test questions popping up for the first quiz. And it's just over the first 2 chapters. So it's over the kind of the beginning basic material. And then you will see that for the 115 class as well. So be looking in that in the next day or so, even probably just later today. You should see some of these popping up. And I believe you get announcements in Canvas. When I post a new quiz, do you guys get something that pops up in your email? I hope. Okay.
You got to sign up for it. You got to like make it so it sends you an email, but yeah, I get it.
Okay, good. So that's a good point. Somebody mentioned, I didn't see who popped up, but you have to sign up for the announcements or queue it up so that it sends you an announcement to your email. All right, so. Okay, so be looking for that. That's the short story, and be reading your book. And I know these first few chapters are a little, not dry, but they just are kind of broad and very general. There's not a lot of specific information in particular, but be checking those out. So today we're going to talk a little bit more about the operating systems and the boot up process. But in particular, I was going to look at, and we mentioned this in the 9 o'clock class too. So between the 2 classes, if you're in the 9 o'clock class, one of the first activities or long-term activities at the end of chapter 1 was installing an operating system into either Hyper-V or VirtualBox. And I'll show you the VirtualBox download site as well. If you haven't seen that, it's Oracle is the company that makes it. You might have heard of them. So they don't really have any fancy screenshots or anything like that, but let's see in the chat. Okay, so VirtualBox, if you're, let's see here, share screen. If you haven't seen this program, this is actually very handy. If you've used Hyper-V, it's similar. The advantages that Hyper-V has is that it's included within Windows. You do have to activate it. You don't necessarily have to download it, but if you go into Windows features, Hyper-V is part of Windows and you just activate it as a feature. Whereas VirtualBox, you do have to download it. Some people do prefer VirtualBox, and we used it in class quite a bit in years past. Primarily, we were using Hyper-V in class because it's also used a little bit more as a server platform. So if you were running at a business and you were incorporating servers, running additional servers in Hyper-V. And the reason you can do that is that if you have a server that has enough RAM, the actual physical hardware, because think about it, if you're running something virtually, you have to run the host you know, the operating system that's hosting it, and you have to have enough resources to run each individual virtualization of the operating system. And for class, we would typically just run one, but with the classroom computers, we had 32 gigs of RAM. So I was able to run, you know, an instance of Windows 10, maybe an instance of Linux, and an instance of Server 2016 or 2019, all in a virtual environment. So VirtualBox helps you with that as well. The reason I mention it is that in the earlier class, I asked how many people were running laptops, and laptops oftentimes do not support Hyper-V. Hyper-V relies on, and this goes into our hardware class with the chapter on CPUs, Hyper-V requires hardware virtualization on the CPU. So the CPU itself has this virtualization aspect to it, and most desktop CPUs do support it these days. Some of the older ones do not. Laptop CPUs could support it, but it's turned off in the BIOS on many of the laptops. And the reason for that, I believe, is just for performance reasons. Maybe they're not expecting people to run virtualization on a laptop, I guess, maybe one of those things. So long story short, if you've got a laptop, you may or may not be able to, to initialize Hyper-V. Whereas you can download VirtualBox and it does not have the same limitations of the CPU. So I'll go ahead and download it anyway. So notice under the download under platforms, you want Windows host, OS X, that's Macintosh, right? And then Linux distributions. So we'll look at under Windows hosts here. All right, so I'll grab that. Okay, so I'm going to stop my share here. So one of your activities is to, in the software class and under the 115, and I'll get my book open here. One of the activities is to prepare for and plan for installations. Now, in a network environment, one of the things you can do is you can do remote installations. So you have a computer or server set up. So for you guys that are on the chat too, I'm probably, if you have a question, I'm probably not going to be able to see it in the chat window that's popping up. So most of you guys are talking about games or video cards or whatever, kind of as a side note, and that's totally fine. I appreciate you guys socializing. And but if somebody legitimately has a question, just yell it out. You know, somehow unmute yourself and say, "Hey, Dave, just interrupt me. I'll hear you," because I can't keep track of both things at the same time. And the other downside is that the chat window does not show up on the recording. So the students that aren't here today or or in another class right now won't see the speak aloud, Dave. Yeah, so yes, you'll have to speak up, unmute yourselves, make yourselves known, and yell out your question. Otherwise, I'll just keep rambling. I made myself some, see, I run CSGO at the lowest settings to get the most frames. See, so it's all game talk in the chat room. And so I'm not going to try to pay attention to that as well. I will get distracted. It's like, oh, squirrel, you know, they're talking about game. So anyway, if you have questions, please just yell them out and I will ignore the chat window pretty much.
So where would we get these, the virtual disk images? Like,
I'm glad you asked that. Are you talking about for installing?
Yeah.
Yes, that's great segue. I appreciate you guys yelling that. Yeah, so anytime you can interrupt me, I appreciate it because then I don't feel like I'm the only one talking to the room. So you guys that have your cameras on, that's also great to be able to see those, see the cameras here. Let's see. All right, so at any rate, yeah, in class, we would have them on a server. We have a file server set up. We actually have network attached storage, which we'll get to. We have a computer that's running FreeNAS, and we have a whole bunch of images on it. Otherwise, you would Google it, or I'll show you on the screen here, share screen, and it looks like this one's screen number 2. Okay, so you would go to Microsoft's Evaluation Center. So I just Googled Windows 10 trial download. Microsoft also makes available, if you're running server platforms, and some of you might choose to install server if you're wanting just to install something to play with. So before you did this, in the chapter, it's talking about preparing for installations, right? So do you have enough hard drive space? We looked at our computers the other day and we're trying to determine, you know, CPU, RAM, all that good stuff. One thing you could do is look on the UEFI or in the BIOS and see if hardware virtualization is supported, there'll be a section under your CPU and it'll say something like CPU virtualization or hardware virtualization. They have different names for it. Is that turned on or off, or is it grayed out? You know, can you not even do that? Microsoft is pretty good about putting out trial versions. And then for their server platform, you can even if it's a legit server installation disk, it'll run for 180 days as a trial. So you don't have to activate it to make it do anything special. So that's kind of cool. And that's a really nice advantage to being able to virtualize stuff, is you can play around with things. And if something goes wrong with it, you can just delete your virtualization, your VDI file, virtual disk image. You can just delete that and then either reinstall it or whatever. The other nice thing about virtualizations is you can make a copy of it. You can clone it if you have enough hard drive space, and then you've got one you can mess with. And if you mess it up, you go to your clone and use that one. So even in the real world, virtualization is used a lot. So I know one of my students works at the PUD, and they bought a server that has, I believe, 512 gigabytes of RAM. Not megabytes, 512 gigabytes of RAM. So they can run a whole bunch of virtual servers. Now, obviously, you have to have a processor that is capable of running these things. And so a lot of the servers are built with 4 individual processors, or maybe 2. Some of them have 4 or even more. And then each of those processors, when we talk about processors in the book as well, each of those processors has multiple cores. So like the Intel processor that's in my computer in the classroom here is a quad core processor. So it essentially kind of has 4 brains on one CPU chip, right? So I don't want to get too off in the weeds, but yeah, all these questions all kind of fit together, hopefully. So somebody asked, where do you get your trial download? So you can just do a quick Google search. Make sure you're downloading it from Microsoft.com and not, some of these other weird websites that say that they've got, there's Softonic and some of these others. So you don't want to get viruses, obviously. So one of the things about, learning this stuff is recognizing legit download sites. Some of you use BitTorrent and stuff like that. So there's obviously copies of programs that are out there, but for class purposes, or if you were installing it to play with it, there's no reason not just to use the trial version and download the trial. Also, when we get to that point too, if you guys are interested in getting signed up for the Microsoft DreamSpark, the school still subscribes to it. So even though you're not in the classroom, I can get you a subscription to it. And if you want to download a legitimate copy of Windows 10, that's on the list. And then also servers on there and some other individual software. It does not have Microsoft Office, but it does have components, so like Vizio's on there and some stuff like that. So some of you might be interested in that, and I can get you set up with an account on that. All right, so under Windows 10, we've got Windows 10 Enterprise. What do you suppose the difference is between Enterprise and Professional? One's big, yeah. So the term Enterprise is kind of weird. This is how you know that, oh, I see somebody grabbing their actual book, their real book there. That's great. So the real deal. So Enterprise generally means large, big business. So if they talk about like enterprise class servers or networks or whatever, you can tell it was probably Star Trek nerds that were naming this stuff. I don't know. So enterprise generally means one that would be used in a larger, big network environment. So you'd have versus Windows 10 Home, obviously, is for home users. And Windows 10 Professional has some differences as well. That is actually one of the things that's in the book. In the book, it's actually talking about Windows 8 for some reason. I think it's because, it's hard to get textbooks that keep up with this stuff. So anything that it says about Windows 8 is generally applicable to Windows 10 too. I thought the book was updated since then, but okay. So we've got 2 choices here. One is Windows 10 Enterprise, and one is LTSC. You guys with your Googling skills, LTSC stands for, I should give out bonus. We should have a little game. We should make it like a game show, and whoever answers first gets like 10 points or something like that. So
long-term servicing channel.
Okay, long-term servicing channel. Very good. So just like if you're familiar with Linux, they'll have long-term support LTS versions of Linux that are supposed to be unchanging for a period of time, and then also you're guaranteed that you'll get updates and driver support and things like that for a longer period of time. So a long-term edition of Windows, basically. And then they've got a description down here, and it'll kind of tell you about it. And they've got a 32-bit ISO too. If you're running it in virtualization, it wouldn't matter which one you pick, but typically you will stick with 64-bit editions of Windows. Your processors, unless your computer is really old, or maybe you're trying to you won't be able to do this on a Chromebook. So if you're trying to use like a Chromebook for some of this stuff, that's not going to work. So otherwise, you could look at that and download the Windows 10 Enterprise from the Evaluation Center. Okay, so I just hit continue there. It asks you to fill in a bunch of stuff. You can do that. Put in autofill there. All right, so I'll just clear it out. Okay, so once you get your ISO, that is a disk image. That's an ISO image. One of the programs, if you were using this in class, that we use a lot is a program called Rufus. And Rufus will make a bootable flash drive for installations. Now, you don't need a bootable flash drive if you are installing this into a virtual environment. All you need is the ISO file. And again, an ISO is basically an image of what would have been on a DVD installation disk. But a lot of computers don't even come with optical drives these days. So it's much more common to make a bootable flash drive. So if you were wanting to put this, this trial version on an actual computer, which you could, if you guys have an older computer laying around that has maybe at least 4 gigs of RAM, it might even run on 2, but not great, or an older laptop or something like that, you could install this version of Windows to that from a flash drive. And I'll show you what Rufus looks like here. Has anybody else used Rufus? I know a couple of you that were in my classes, we used it, but. So you should be able to see this on your screen here. This is all Rufus looks like. It's just a little program here. You select your ISO, you put in your flash drive, it'll appear up under device settings. You select your ISO, and then you basically just click start, and it makes your flash drive bootable, which is super handy. So if you're installing Linux onto a machine or version of Windows, something like that, this is a great little utility program. It's a quick, easy download. If you start typing in Rufus, you either get something about Rufus Wainwright, some singer, or this program as the top hit. So make sure you're getting it from the correct download side. They've got other links to it there, but super handy program to use for installation purposes. Okay, so somebody was asking where you get the ISOs from. That's just Google it and then get them from Microsoft's Evaluation Center. They have evaluations for server platform and stuff like that as well. So good questions. And it's probably around a 6 gig download, something like that. Is anybody downloading it right now? If you don't have, and if you're creating a virtual machine, you'll want to give yourself probably like at least 20 gigabytes of space in your virtual machine. Now, what you'll also notice is, or maybe give yourself 30, if you're trying out VirtualBox, let's say, if we were looking at VirtualBox to download, they have the option to make the virtual disks. So essentially what you're doing is you're creating a folder, and then that folder becomes the installation drive for your operating system. So if you're planning this out and trying to figure it out, you'll create a folder. Now, VirtualBox and Hyper-V both have options to use what's called dynamic disks. So let's say you allocate 30 gigabytes. It's not going to use 30 gigabytes until it needs it. So it'll start out small, as much as the installation requires, and it'll gradually get bigger. The other thing to take note of if you're using Hyper-V or VirtualBox, and I'll walk through an installation in VirtualBox later, but you'll want to make sure you're giving it enough RAM. And they, oddly enough, in Hyper-V will measure it in megabytes. So how many megabytes is in a gigabyte, roughly? Don't all yell at once.
Was it like
1,000?
900?
Okay, yeah, I heard 1,000. So yeah, roughly 1,000, 1024 or 1,000, roughly 1,000 megabytes per gigabyte. So if you're trying to allocate RAM, remember that it's sharing the RAM from your main system, and it can do that dynamically too. So if you guys had 8 gigabytes of RAM and you gave your virtual machine 4 gigabytes, you're essentially giving away half of your RAM, right? So that can cause your main system to slow down a little bit. If you have 16 gigabytes RAM, that's healthier. You can give away a little bit, give away a little bit more. I would recommend giving your virtual machine at least 2 gigabytes of RAM. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but keep in mind that your virtual machine isn't going to be playing games and doing a bunch of stuff. So 2 gigabytes or even 3 would be fine for a virtual machine, and then save the rest for the host operating system. So here's a beginner's guide to VirtualBox. Your book has some instructions in the 9 o'clock class for Hyper-V. So at any rate, this would be a good thing to take a look at, mainly because in your software book, that's a lot of what they're talking about in chapter 2 is installing Windows. And we typically go through that chapter pretty quickly in class, and I'm not going to belabor you guys with lectures on installing Windows. So you can read through that part of the chapter. You will have some quiz questions coming up. They talk about the different versions of Windows, and this is where you guys should probably take some time we just looked at Enterprise versus LTSC. So look up the current versions of Windows 10 to see what's out there. And we'll talk about what the differerences are. That'll be a good discussion to have. One quick one off the bat is that Windows 10 Pro, how many of you are running Windows 10 Pro? And then if you're running a laptop or it came with the computer, how many are running Windows 10 Home Edition? Okay. And they both work great. There isn't any real huge difference for home users. One of the restrictions is that with the home version, you can't join it to a domain. We'll be talking more about domain environments and what that means. But you can't join a Windows 10 Home Edition to a domain environment, but you can do that with Windows 10 Pro. So, in terms of our how we're working stuff in the classroom, for us, you guys being at home, don't think it makes much difference. So, well, take that back. With Hyper-V, that might be another reason to use VirtualBox if you're running Windows 10 Home. I'm trying to think if Windows 10 Home Edition has Hyper-V as an option under your features menu. I guess you'll find out, right? So you'll figure it out. Okay, so different versions of Windows. Chapter 2 also talks about Windows networking connections and domain setup. So let's take a look here. I'm going to open up at the bottom of your screen, at the lower right-hand corner, you'll have a little icon that represents your network access or your network icon. You can also type in your search box, type in network settings, or just start typing network, and then you've got your settings menu. I usually use the icon on the toolbar. You can get to this several different ways. Also, what you'll discover is that Windows has essentially 2 menu systems. It has kind of the professional menu, or kind of one that looks more like server, and then it has these kind of dumbed down application menu systems for system settings too. So there's 2 ways to get to this stuff. You can't see at the bottom of my screen. I'm sharing the wrong screen here. Let's try this. All right, so down at the bottom, I'm not sure if you can see this. I'm going to right click on my network icon and then go to network and internet settings and open that up. I'll have to share my other, this is goofy here. All right, try that. Okay, so there's my network settings. And normally with computers, they are set to obtain, so I go to change adapter options. Of course, it's showing up on my other screen here. All right, so normally with computers, they're set to obtain an address automatically. How many of you are not in the 9 o'clock section? Weren't here for 9 a.m. lectures. All right, not a problem. Again, that's a reason to separate the recordings and separate the classes. So we were talking about one of the protocols that's used on the network is DHCP, and that's called Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, DHCP. And for you guys at home, it's wireless. Under most circumstances, that's how your computer gets an address. It's given out either via a wireless router or it's given out by a DHCP server. In my classroom in here and in some network environments, and in particular for servers, Now I've also got Hyper-V installed, so you'll notice that I've got this network switch thing going on, and then here is my Ethernet adapter. My network switch is set up so that my host computer and my Hyper-V installations both go through this network switch. Because when you think about it, if you're running Hyper-V or VirtualBox, you might have 2 or even 3 operating systems, but you only really have one real network connection, correct? You know, in this case, I have one cable coming out the back of the computer going into the network, or you might have one wireless adapter or whatever. So when you install Hyper-V or you install VirtualBox, it's going to create one of these switches. And typically, when you get the switch configured, that's where you would make your settings changes. For you guys at home, you don't really have to mess with it because you have DHCP running. For us in the classroom, this was an issue. We had to go in and we actually have to set our IP address in here. So this is where you would do your network configuration. This is what's called a static IP address. So static means that it doesn't change until the user makes the change, right? Sure, just nod and pretend like it's like, yeah, sure, right. Your computers, if you guys are following along, and you guys should try to find these settings. So if you're in your network network settings under network connections, you should see there's like a wireless configuration. You will also see probably Ethernet. You may not be using your Ethernet adapter. You're probably using wireless. And by default, they'll say obtain an IP address automatically. And that just tells the computer when it boots up, go out there and look for an IP address and come back and get one. We looked at the IP config command earlier. So under your command prompt, and again, remember you had IP config / and if I do it, I'll go ahead and do it. If I say release, gotta type it right, it'll tell me I can't do that because my network card is configured for a static address. It'll only release the address if it's set up to obtain one automatically. So it'll say, I'm going to give up this address. And then the other command you could do would be, after you release it, would be to renew the address. And again, it's going to say it's not going to do that because my particular network card is configured with a static address. This is my actual address that goes out to the outside world. Now, one interesting thing, you guys might think it's interesting, is that this top part of this dialog box is separate from the bottom part. So if you're running through your internet service provider, they're going to give you an address. They're also going to define your DNS server. And if you want to choose to use a different DNS server, you can do that. So maybe you want to use Google directly. You don't have to use, so if you leave the top part, like, if you leave the top part as obtain address automatically, this bottom part you could set. So 8888, that's Google's DNS server. If I wanted to use one of the open DNS servers, there's one that's all ones, so 1.1.1.1. So some people that are concerned about privacy issues and stuff like that, they might choose to use an open DNS server that's out on the internet to do their DNS lookups. So if you're looking up, google.com or whatever, it'll give you the IP address. So DNS is what takes what you're looking for and finds you the IP address of the server at the other end, if you're curious. So if you wanted to set that, you could change yours if you wanted to. Instead of obtaining it automatically, you could put in one of the servers that's out there on the internet, and there's a list of them. So I can put it up on the board if you're curious, or you can Google it. So if you want to just look up like open DNS servers. Okay, so here's a whole bunch of them, and there's an explanation of what OpenDNS is, things like that. So here's a list of them: best free and public DNS servers in 2020. A whole big list of DNS servers, and you can type in the address. So here's a bunch of addresses for DNS. Here's one of them, 1.1.1. That's one of the OpenDNS servers. So again, security issue. Maybe you want to choose to use one that's not related to your ISP, or maybe you want one that's faster. So maybe faster DNS lookup. Okay, so taking a look at your book real quickly here. That's actually for the hardware class. So your first quiz is going to be over chapters 1 and 2. There's not a ton of questions on it. In a few days, you'll get the one for CTS 110 first, and then the 115 one will come out a couple days later. I'm going to try to stagger them a little bit, and they'll be due at different dates. But neither one is going to be a super long quiz, so don't stress out about it being like this, 50 questions or 100 questions or whatever. There'll be between 10 and 20 questions to start with, just to kind of get us jump started. There'll be some true false and some multiple choice, and they're like literally right out of the book. Do you guys have questions at all so far?
When is the quiz due?
Okay, so it'll show up on Canvas. It'll be due on, one of them will be due on Monday, and I'll probably stagger the other one to Tuesday or Wednesday. But they're going to be quite short for this first, so you'll have tomorrow through the weekend, and then they'll be due early next week. So,
Okay, thank you.
Good questions, yeah. And I don't want people to stress out about it. Really, the quizzes, think of them like graded homework. I mean, it's not like you have to be reading the book and taking notes and memorizing it and coming into class and, regurgitating it onto a bubble sheet. I'm hoping that it's just mainly an incentive to read the book, and you guys look at it that way. You're like reading through the book. It's like, okay, it's kind of a knowledge check to make sure you're actually, actually looking at the book a little bit. And I recognize these first couple of chapters are a little, abstract in a sense. One of the things they talk about are, and just to kind of get this back on track here, what they call our FRUs. So I don't know that there's any industry, maybe medical industry, but I don't think there's any industry that is more full of acronyms than the computer industry. They even have an acronym for that. A TLA is an abbreviation for a 3-letter acronym. So I always thought that was kind of a dumb joke, but so they even have an acronym. They even have an acronym for acronyms or abbreviations. So I get it. There's a lot of jargon, but the important thing is to try to start putting this into your vocabulary. So what I do when I'm reading through the books or new material, maybe it's something new in networking, is usually with the book, they'll explain what the abbreviation is when it first appears, and then later in the book, they'll simply use the 3-letter or 4-letter abbreviation. So in your mind, be decoding it. Say, okay, DNS, domain name system, or FTP, file transfer protocol, whatever it happens to be. In your mind, try to figure out what it is. And if you're not sure or can't remember, maybe go back a couple pages and be like, oh, okay, that's what it stands for, right? So in the book, they're talking about field replaceable units. And one of the field replaceable units is a power supply. Now this one happens to be for a server. So this is a modular power supply. And you can notice it's got a big handle on the back of it and locking screws. So some servers are designed so you can remove the power supply while the computer is running because it has more than one power supply. Not uncommon for servers to have 2 modular bay power supplies. So here's another one. Notice the handle on the back and a locking tab. So they're designed to have some redundancy. Whereas your home computer, you've got one power supply, obviously. So if you're looking at a home computer's power supply,
don't unplug it.
Yeah, obviously don't unplug it while it's running. That would be a bad thing. So if you're hot swapping power supplies in a server, obviously it has to be designed for it. You would see on the back of it, it's got 2 power supplies. You can yank one out and replace it while the thing is running so that you're not going to have any downtime. The reason the book calls them field replaceable units is just that. You could replace this out in the field. It doesn't require taking the computer completely apart. And also with it being called a field replaceable unit, they are saying that this is a one-piece device and not to take it apart. And this brings up the issue of, in the book and certifications and things like that, they will have kind of a set way of doing things. And one of those reasons is for safety. So, if this is plugged into the wall, inside of this thing, you've got 110 volts, right? Or 120, depending on how you're wanting to measure it, right? And that's enough to give you a pretty good zap. They also have what's inside of here is a capacitor. How many people have heard the term capacitor? Anybody have a big stereo in your car? Anybody own a stun gun, zapper device? Some of you probably do, right? I got my, what's that? Go ahead.
They are used on AC units a lot.
Yes, absolutely. So a capacitor allows this so the power supply, when we talk about power supplies, it has a pretty interesting job. It takes the wall outlet, which is AC, as he just mentioned, alternating current, and it converts it to direct current. It also takes this voltage, which is 110 or 120 volts, and it converts it into 12 volts, 5 volts, and 3 volts for your computer's inside usage, right? So inside of here are some magic components, one of which is a capacitor. And I mentioned stun guns, not as a joke, well, kind of. A stun gun works because it charges up a capacitor, and then, somebody's in the waiting room here for some reason, and then the stun gun has the ability to release all of that electricity, or a huge amount of it, at one time, and it makes that little arc of electricity come across. So in terms of field replaceable unit, the book is doing this also to CYA. You know what CYA stands for? Cover your butt, right? So they don't want people monkeying with this stuff. So if I was to take this apart, I can see some pretty big capacitors in there. And if you weren't careful and you got a screwdriver in there, you could ground yourself out to the capacitor and potentially shock yourself. So they basically don't want you opening up a power supply. Now, I will admit that for power supplies in a home computer, I have opened them enough to replace the fan. It is not recommended in the book, but you know, if I was poor, I didn't have, you know, college student, I didn't have any money, and I noticed that the fan, it was making some noise. Sometimes, you know, fans are one of the few moving parts on a computer. So sometimes the computer's making, you probably heard them kind of squealing, making this groaning noise. And every once in a while, sometimes I'll even like bang on the side of the case, and then the fan starts spinning up and goes. So the bearings are starting to go out. So yes, I have replaced a fan inside of a power supply. They don't recommend it. If the fan quits completely, these power supplies get hot very quickly and the power supply dies, and you'll just replace the whole power supply. And that's what the book recommends, is just simply FRU, field replaceable unit. You order a whole new power supply and replace the whole thing. So, and we'll get into power supplies specifically and testing them a little bit later. There's a good way of testing them. They sell a little testing device, or you can also use a multimeter. Do you guys know what a multimeter is? Digital voltmeter. I'll show you a quick picture one. Okay, so they look like this. And I've got a whole bag of them in the classroom. So they come in different shapes inside, but most of them are kind of the same. You've got two probes that are attached to wires for testing purposes, and you've got a big knob on the front of them. You twist the knob around until you're at, you know, volts / DC, because you're measuring direct current. So we're trying to see if the power supply puts out, you know, 12 volts or whatever happens to be on the plug, right? So there's a way to test power supplies, and that's one of the things they get into in the chapter on power supplies. They do go out. Typically, when they go out, it's because the fan has died and they've gotten too hot. So, you know, not too big a deal. But and this is one of those little tools that if you were working in the industry, it's a nice tool to have. And they range in price from, this one's very expensive, all the way to fairly cheap one. Here's one for $29 or even less. You know, just a little tiny multimeter. You don't have to spend a ton of money on them. Here's one on Amazon. You've got, here's 29, 30 bucks. $12.99. Here you go. Look at that. What a bargain. Okay. So this is a good picture of a really cheap multimeter. Here on the screen, you can see that they've got settings for voltage, and they've got different ranges. So you'd probably want to go to the DC section and set it to measure, you know, in the 20 to 50 range, something like that, or less. Okay. So in terms of other field replaceable units, if you guys looked at that part of the book, somebody said, sorry, I said I wasn't going to look at the chat, and then I did anyway. And somebody says, I just steal my dad's, and somebody says same. So yeah, if you need a multimeter and you can steal one from somebody, that's fine. And they do have a battery in them that goes dead. So repair, you know, they don't work off the voltage of the device they're measuring. You do have to replace a battery in the multimeters every once in a while.
David said I could steal. Can confirm.
Yeah, can confirm. So if you've got one, somebody you can steal from, that's great. If not, you know, as you start putting together parts or tools to use, the book talks about tools, and in addition, like a wrist strap, a little static wrist strap. Not a bad idea. They're really cheap. I at home oftentimes don't use one. I'll just work on like linoleum or a wood floor in the kitchen, so I'm not standing on carpet. You can also ground yourself out while you're working on a computer. This is all out of the first couple of chapters. The other thing they recommend is that if you are working on the system, obviously you unplug it, right? But then also you push the power button on the front of the computer, and that helps dissipate any remaining electricity inside the power supply's capacitors. And sometimes you can even see it. If you're working on the system, there'll be a little LED on the middle of the motherboard that's glowing, and that indicates that the computer is plugged in. It may not even be on, but the whole time the computer is plugged in, it's getting some power going through the motherboard. Not a lot, but it's still on. So you unplug it, and you'll see that little light still going to keep glowing for quite a while. And then you push the power button, and the light goes out. So that gives you an extra reassurance that there's no juice going through circuitry. Because they talk about static electricity, and I mentioned it before. If you can see the little zap of electricity, it's putting out a lot of voltage, but not hardly any amps, so it's not going to hurt you. It might give you a little, might give you a little zap, but it will certainly damage electronic components. So static electricity is not your friend. Ground yourself out, unplug the computer, push the power button. And I don't know how many times in class, people get in a hurry and they've got 2 or 3 people maybe looking over a computer and working on it, and they'll forget to unplug it. And they'll be pulling components out and putting it back in. And that's a really good way to ruin components. In the junky computers we're playing with in class, it doesn't often matter if somebody destroys one. It's not the end of the world. If it's your own computer or you're working on somebody else's kind of nice computer and you zap it or work on it plugged in and you misalign something, like if you're replacing a video card, that'll kill your motherboard really quickly. So just double check that every time you work on it. Somebody mentions in the chat, don't wear socks on carpet. Absolutely, yeah, just and so yeah, don't be wearing wool socks and rubbing your feet around and then work on a system. Okay, so all good information. Again, in the book, it's pretty general to start with, and it gets a little bit, builds up to it. I don't want to bore you too much. I will also be trying to round up some bits and pieces. I've got a camera set up so I can show you for instance, if we're testing power supplies, I'll show you how to do that. There's a quick way to do it with the multimeter and, of all things, a paper clip. They have a tool for it where you can plug it into the power adapter, which is your P1 connector that comes off of the power supply. So this computer, if I can pull this out of here, you can't see inside there. It's got a bundle of wires that come out of the power supply. This one's here's the power supply up here. And then you've got your P1 connector, which is the big plastic connector that connects right to the motherboard. So 2 of those wires, one of them is green, and then any of the black wires, if you connect those 2 with a paper clip, it'll power up that power supply outside of the case. So if you're trying to test a power supply, you can take it out of the case, or if you have an extra one, you can test it pretty easily with some fairly basic tools. You don't need to have the power supply tester and all that good stuff, which if you look those up, just another little quick, keep sharing my screen. I could just leave it on there since you don't. Okay, so here's pictures of some power supply testers. We've got one in the cabinet, a couple of them in the cabinet. Ours looks just like that, but you don't need it. I mean, it's another 20 bucks or whatever. And how often do you use one? Not very often. But if you have a multimeter, or you can steal one and a paper clip, you can test your own power supplies really easily, and you can see if they're putting out the proper voltage. Okay. All right. Any other questions about power supply? Oh, that was the other one. In the book, what are the other field replaceable units? Aha, you guys haven't read the book. Don't worry about it. I wasn't expecting me to
Optical drives? I forgot to mute myself. Maybe? I don't know.
All right. I got to quit looking in the chat room. It's distracting. It's like, oh, people are talking about giant mouse pads or something like that. So, oh, it's in the chat room there. Okay, so at any rate, other field replaceable units might be things like a hard drive, right? You've got your good old hard drives you can replace. This one is a standard desktop size hard drive. Now, obviously, if you're replacing a hard drive, that opens up another issue of having to reinstall or copy data from one hard drive to another. We had a student asking about programs that can do that. There's one called Macrium Reflect. There's an open source program called Clonezilla, where you can take one hard drive and plug it into another one and take all the data and clone it to the other drive. Typically, How many of it have been installed Windows from scratch? Like you've reinstalled your computer completely? Reinstalled Windows, so a couple of you. That's usually preferable to doing some sort of cloning operation, or Windows 10 has the option to do a restore operation. Have any of you used the restore operation that Windows has? Or reset the PC? It's actually called reset. I don't see a lot of people maybe in the chat, so I don't know. No. Okay, so if you do have to do a recovery on Windows 10, and this is actually built into Windows 10, so this is a good thing to show you real quickly, is that Windows 10 has the ability to do a recovery, and it's good to understand the options for resetting the PC. You do have the option to maintain your system files, but you're going to lose some of your data, so you need to be careful about that. You might have to reinstall software, which includes games and things like that. So if you're working with somebody in tech support and they say, oh, okay, just go into reset, and you say it says if your PC isn't running well, resetting it might help. This lets you choose between keeping your personal files or removing everything. So really what this is doing is an in-place reinstallation. Now it's not quite the same as wiping out the whole computer drive and doing a complete reinstall. But it is a good way to do a recovery. But keep in mind, if you have game files and things like that, you'll want to save those and back those up, and you may have to reinstall your games too. Where Steam lets you back up the whole game too. Has anybody done that where you backed up your entire game so you don't have to download it again? You know, because you might have 200 gigabytes of games that you've installed. So backing up the actual game files to an external drive before you do a reinstallation is a big deal. And that's one of the things we'll talk about too is, you know, if you're doing work on somebody else's computer, I usually ask them like 5 times, have you backed up your information, or can you back it up? Do you have the ability to do that? Does the computer back up enough, or does the computer boot up enough that you can back up data? They do sell little adapters. I've got one in the cupboard where you can take this hard drive and plug it into an adapter and then plug it into a USB port. So one of the students was asking before, he has a computer that's dead. The video card's dead, it's integrated. But if he takes the hard drive out, you can take the hard drive in and plug it into a different computer to the USB port, and then get your data back off of a dead computer. So doing data recovery is a big one. That's part of what's covered in this class. Data recovery, fixing the computer, talking to the customer is in the software book. They have a whole chapter on how to be nice. You guys laugh, but there's a whole chapter on how to be nice to people, or at least pretend to be nice. If you don't actually, because there's some people that are just like, you know, the joke is maybe they shouldn't even own a computer to begin with, but you still have to be nice and ask them the right questions. And there's leading questions you can ask to try to figure out what the problem is. And that's part of being a good tech support person and all that. But yeah, there's a whole chapter on how to be nice. Usually I show people a little video. There used to be a character on Saturday Night Live that was just like the world's worst rude IT computer guy, and he'd like push people out of the way. He's like, move, get out of the way, you know, and he sits down at the computer and fixes. He's like, hey, is that so hard? Yeah, so Elena says she has 2 dead computers that need the hard drive backed up. I've got a device here for that. I usually can loan it out to people, but I'm not sure with all the stuff we've got going on if that'll work. But on Amazon, they sell them pretty cheap. I'll show you real quick. Hard drive, external adapter. Okay, so this will be the last share of screen, and then we'll quit for the day. But this is actually a really handy little device. If we're talking about tools that you can buy for IT type stuff, these external, so you can see it's got a USB port on one end. The one I have is USB 2.0, so I was thinking about ordering a USB 3.0 because they're quite a bit faster. And then they have the adapter for either a SATA connection, or some of them have the connection for the older ribbon cables, which we'll look at as well. But these are super handy, and they're like anywhere from 20 to 30 bucks. Here's one that's got a little box, so you can take the hard drive and actually kind of plug it into this little box, and then you plug it into your computer that's working. Now, as long as your hard drive is actually functional, like it's not a dead hard drive was causing the problem, you can recover the data from this. And that's a nice option for people. If they've got a dead computer, take the hard drive out, recover the data that you hope is still on there, and then you can fix the computer, put a new hard drive in it, and do a reinstallation.
So could you use the external hard drive for like extra storage, kind of?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So so that one that I showed you that had the little, so like this one that has the little box, that you could totally use that for extra. So if you have some extra hard drives laying around, the one that has the little box would be nice. You can just plug it in. Either way, it doesn't have to look like that. Copy your data to this thing and then put this in a desk drawer for safekeeping. You know, I might label it backup drive or something like that. So yeah, if you've got some extra hard drives kicking around, they can be used for external storage using one of these adapters. And then you want to be careful not to obviously drop them or, you know, subject them to any bad things. But yeah, definitely external storage. We're running out of time. Oh, sorry, go ahead. One more question.
So would an external hard drive like that be more practical than like an SS or like a solid state?
The solid states have definite advantages. Capacity is usually the big one for these. Like you can still get a traditional hard drive that's way, way bigger than a solid state drive for the cost. Solid state externals, they're starting to make those too, and they're more durable in terms of shock absorbance and stuff like that because there's no moving parts. But yeah, if you're just, and then with these adapters, you know, you could just use a regular hard drive and stick this in the cupboard. But yeah, what they're selling you when you buy an external hard drive is basically a little laptop drive, typically inside a permanent enclosure with one of these adapters kind of built into it. So very similar technology. Okay, we'll take a look at, yeah, some people are talking about external hard drive. So yeah, we'll talk more about, and if you guys have questions, these questions that are popping up in the chat room, next time we meet, yell them out. And so I can't keep track of the chat room as well, and it doesn't show up in the videos anyway. So I'm gonna head and stop recording. I've got more students that are gonna try to be coming in for the next session here. So I'll put stop recording.